Good afternoon, and welcome to this week's episode of Supply Chain Talk. My name is Alistair Chariton, your host this week. Our main topic is nth party supplier risks in the modern supply chain. But before we get onto that, we'll be discussing a relevant news item, and I'll introduce my guest in a moment. Just as a reminder, if you're registered on Business Reporter website, that's great, and do join in the conversation in the chat. If you're on LinkedIn, of course, please do comment, and we'll try and pick those up. But if you do want to register for future episodes on Business Reporter, it makes life easier for everyone to see your comments. And in terms of those, as always, the Supply Chain Talk mug will be awarded for the comment or question that we find the most valuable. So please do keep those coming, and we'll try and pick up on as many of those as we can. So let me bring on the first of my three guests, who is a familiar face on the show, and that is Pam Wiseman, who is a principal for supply chain strategy at Supply Chain Advisory Services, LLC. And Pam is based near Baltimore in the US. She is a 30-year veteran executive leader in global supply chain and manufacturing with experience in aerospace, electronics, industrial, medical devices, and healthcare. And in 2021, she started up her own supply chain consulting firm. An interesting fact about Pam is that when deciding to go and do an MS in electrical engineering, she also considered a very alternative path of going to cooking school. So it sounds a little bit like a kind of sliding doors moment, but happily for supply chain, she's remained in the industry. So welcome, Pam.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our second guest is Agnes Odimaha, who is a supply chain lead for Shell, and she's based in Lagos, Nigeria. Welcome, Agnes. She's worked at Shell in Nigeria for 7 years and is currently a supply chain commercial lead there, but has also worked in purchasing and contracts. And her passion for supply chain can be traced back to her childhood, as she loved accompanying her mum to the local grocery market, and her mum used to call her purchasing manager. So great you were inspired that early on. I think we've often discussed on the program that the need to get new blood into the supply chain industry. So that's a great story. And our third guest is Marcelo Arantes, who is Chief Operating Officer at Grupo Elfa, based in Sao Paulo in Brazil. Marcelo has more than 30 years of experience in leading operations and supply chain in multiple sectors of FMCG, rail, shipping, airlines, and retail. And away from work, Marcelo has some talent in acting because he was an extra in the Hollywood movie Wise Girls. I don't know whether it's a speaking part or just a humble extra, but that's a great story, Marcelo. So welcome all three of you. So let's introduce our article, which is it was reported in quite a few papers in the UK, but we've taken it from The Guardian just at the end of last year. And it's headlined that Chris Packham and Caroline Lucas accuse the RSPCA of legitimizing cruelty. So for our international audience, I think I better explain all three of those key things. So Chris Packham is a very well-known presenter on the BBC, focusing particularly on nature and wildlife, and is a very well-known sort of environmentalist. And Caroline Lucas is the former leader of the Green Party in the UK, so very well known, very sort of respected speaker in Parliament, but also on green and environmental issues. And the RSPCA stands for the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and it's a very long established animal welfare charity. I think it's probably almost 100 years old, or even more perhaps. So yeah, very well-known figures. And so why is it that Chris Packham and Caroline Lucas resigned from the RSPCA, and they were on the board of the RSPCA? And it's because there was an investigation which revealed animal cruelty taking place at abattoirs. And these were abattoirs which were RSPCA approved. The RSPCA had set up a scheme called RSPCA Assured, which basically audited and visited and certified farms and abattoirs and places like that. So, and kind of, you could say, well, you can have a problem where an auditing scheme might miss something. Surely that's not a reason to resign. But they felt, Chris Packham and Caroline Lucas, they felt that the RSPCA hadn't taken the lapses, the gaps seriously enough. They hadn't responded well enough, and so on. And basically, they're saying that the certification scheme was basically failing, and it was a catastrophe, and the scheme should be stopped. Lots of interesting points there, and I think what it kind of says is if expected national charity like the RSPCA inspecting sites in the UK, on its own territory almost, if that can still miss widespread issues at some locations, it does make us ask the question: how can companies have confidence in inspection schemes and auditors, further down the supply chain and thousands of miles away? So turning to you first, Pam, I don't know what your thoughts were on this news story.
Well, thank you for inviting me today. This is a very interesting topic. And to be honest with you, I once had a supply chain that actually had pigs in it. So it's kind of more relevant for me. We were making, actually in a plant in Leeds in the UK, we're making hernia mesh from porcine pig skin, actually.
Right.
So you made me kind of go back to those days. But I think there comes incredible responsibility and accountability if you have a complex supply chain with, multiple networks and levels. And, I think, well, first of all, the fact that it was right in their backyard is sort of a shame. But it's hard to manage these multi-level supply chains across the globe. I had electronic supply chains similar to that across the globe. A lot of it was in Asia and other countries. And I once participated in a panel about corporate social responsibility, and taking those responsibilities throughout your supply chain, labor and different types of treatment and debts and things like that, and your hazardous chemicals and all those types of things. If you're going to build the product, you have to take responsibility for it and actually have enough resources to manage it properly. Otherwise, you could have a huge risk to your brand, to your business, and if you make it complicated, you have to manage it. So,
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll move on to some more of that in our main topic. But it's an interesting example that in medical supply chains, there's animal welfare issues in products you wouldn't necessarily have thought would involve that.
yes.
Agnes, what are your thoughts on this story?
Oh, absolutely. I was just going to pick up from where Pam stopped, and she said, if you have the supply chain, you should have the resources for it. So I think picking up from the story, the fact that the failure came from a third-party certification agency, and because the organization, has completely put their trust in the certification agency. Like Pam said, I don't think that is the way supply chain should continue. We have to still be embedded, even if we are sourcing such huge responsibility to a third party. We should also do well to find a way to have our people do what we call the go-see. And hi, everyone, just to say, just a little bit of reminder that yes, I currently work with Shell, but my views and opinions on this conversation today are solely mine and wouldn't be in any way representing, Shell opinions. Thank you. Thank you, Alice.
Okay, thanks, Agnes. Marcelo, yeah, your thoughts on this one? Oh, you're on mute. We can't hear you, sorry.
Oh, first of all, thanks to invite me. Yeah, it reminds me a problem I had in the past when I led the supply chain of the biggest Latin airline corporation here in Brazil, Latin Airlines. We hired a supplier for providing our uniforms. And the truth is, the provider was using Bolivian people living in slave conditions. It was terrible. It was in the news. It had a huge damage to our image. So it's always a problem. And the truth is, the deeper you go in the supply chain, the less visibility you have in your process, right? And nowadays, this is probably the most difficult challenge supply chain has to control it, to have the transparency, to know what is happening in the third, fourth, fifth suppliers, because if it's hard to control your first tier supplier, it's even harder to control the second and third when sometimes they are in other countries. So it's a life challenge we face nowadays, and I believe that we're gonna have to battle to face this battle with a lot of technology and compliance issues.
Yeah. Okay. No, thank you, Marcelo. And yeah, we'll get on to some of the technology and other ways that we can handle that. And just picking up, there's a nice point from Sheldon talking about tinned tuna and some years ago the fact that dolphins were being endangered by the nets and lines being used to catch tuna. So I guess it's a reminder again that there's animal welfare and animal sort of environmental impact can come in many products. Thanks for that reminder, Sheldon. So let's move to our main topic. And as a reminder, the title is Nth Party Supplier Risks in the Modern Supply Chain. And our first discussion point on this is identifying hidden vulnerabilities, uncovering risks in lower tier suppliers, and understanding their impact on the overall supply chain. So I think perhaps if we split that into risk and impact. So first of all, in terms of risks, are there sort of different risks that we need to think about in lower tier suppliers versus our primary suppliers? And sort of how far down the supply chain do you need to worry about risks? So turning to you first, Pam.
So, to me, there's really no difference in the primary suppliers versus the nth level. As a matter of fact, it's probably easier to understand your primary suppliers and more difficult as you go down the chain. But it's the responsibility, and I've heard a phrase, maybe it was used in the military or somewhere, but you can delegate authority, but you cannot delegate responsibility and accountability. So if you're outsourcing or creating, a pretty complex supply chain, you need to be ultimately responsible and have the accountability for it for your business. I don't think there's any difference. I think the hidden lurking risks in the nth layer are just as real as the ones that you might know better. I think it's definitely harder to understand them, but you could have more control over the more risky and complex parts of your supply chain. You could employ local people to go in and help monitor it for you as sort of an independent set of eyes. I know I used to travel once a quarter to 10 global plants from the Dominican Republic to Shanghai to Leeds, England to Galway, in Ireland, all over the world to visit plants once a quarter. I mean, it was necessary for us to run the business. And those were our own plants, not even the suppliers. So
Yeah. Okay. No, it's an interesting point that, having your feet on the ground in your view is pretty important. Agnes, what are your thoughts? I mean, I think thinking perhaps of lower tier suppliers, sometimes they may be more sort of substitutable. Your primary suppliers, you probably developed a close relationship with. So if something goes wrong with them, it's pretty serious. You can't just say, sorry, you're out of here, I'm going to another one. Whereas I guess if you found an issue with a second, third tier supplier, you might more easily be able to say, okay, that component, I'm getting it straight away from someone else. Well, what are your thoughts, Agnes, on the sort of how you manage on those different tiers down the supply chain?
So personally, I think you would even want to give especially depends on where the level at which your business is and how deep your supply chain goes. You would even want to give major attention to your NTS suppliers, as it were, because I know there is this in those days saying, in my early days in supply chain, the first thing I learned is that you have as ethical as your least supplier, right? So there is no disassociating yourself from them. So again, they go see, they trying to find out where is my supplier getting their stuff from. So I'll give you a typical example. In Nigeria, for instance, in the urban city where I live, Lagos, we have big, grocery stores, majorly when it comes to the farming where the fresh produce are from. You wouldn't find them around here. They go back to the north. And in fact, I'm telling you about places where you might only be able to get maybe 3/4 of the journey by flight, and the rest has to be by road, and not very tarred road. And, imagine that's kind of a supply chain. You have a big grocery store with a big, sometimes franchise name. That's the supermarket. And you do not know where the watermelon, the celery or something, or the onion that you have in your store is coming from, whether they are being exposed to, workers that are, exposed to child labor, or, inappropriate method of working. So if I think, like I mentioned earlier, it really has to do with how deep your operations are. That's how much you would even give more intentional attention to your end supplier, as opposed to your first year, because your first year, for instance, it will be the person that you have your direct contract with, and the person may have even signed up to your code of conduct and stuff like that. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Marcelo, your thoughts on this?
Yes, I believe that the answer for that question, how far it should go in the supply chain, is you need to go to the bottom. You need to manage your own supply chain, because for the client, it doesn't matter if the arrow was made in the 50, 60, 70 tire. Who's going to pay the bill? It's going to be you, because it's your product that it's there. And I remember a case, for example, for the biggest retail here in Brazil, Carrefour, when a security guy, which is contracted by the firm, it's a port tire contractor. He took a guy stealing in the supermarket, and it killed. It beat it to death until it to kill the guy. And the truth is, the media, the client, they all went after Carrefour. They didn't want to know who he hired, why he hired. So if you don't control your whole value chain, you are certainly at a risk.
Yeah. Okay. No, thank you. And that sort of relates, I suppose, a little bit to the impact in our discussion point here about, uncovering the risks and understanding their impact on the overall supply chain. And I guess in terms of that there's going to be sort of, direct, tangible impacts that you can assess. What would happen if a particular second, third tier supplier failed? Would you be running out of a particular raw material? Could you find an alternative source to that raw material? But I guess there's the intangible impacts, like reputational damage, which of course we're all touching on. And I suppose in that, if you've got your primary suppliers to sign up to your code of conduct and so on, and you're auditing them, should you, do you still have to be really worried about the reputational impact lower down the supply chain? I think from what we're hearing, your supply chain is as weak as the sort of the weakest point. But Pam, what's your views? I mean, can you say, well, look, we've done the right things with our primary suppliers, we just can't be held responsible for what happens further down the supply chain?
So much of my experience has been with engineered products that have custom components and are designed especially uniquely for the product that's being built. There are very few off-the-shelf components that are, easily substituted. So for me, it's even beyond the supplier themselves and the nth tier. It's their choices of transportation, it's how they stock materials, it's inventory risk, it's, all those weather, location, all those different things that have to be assessed. And you can't assess everything. There are some risks that you're never going to uncover. For example, the suppliers in the U.S. could be as risky as the suppliers in somewhere else in the world to a U.S. manufacturer. So just having it near shored or what have you doesn't necessarily take out all the risk. But I think documenting the supply chain and having a really well laid out communication plan and metrics, and a participation in the supply chain and really overseeing the activities with a very specific management plan. I know that's coming up next, but I think you can't substitute having it documented and having excellent communication all the way along. So making it very complicated unnecessarily would be like the first thing to go, just
Yeah.
right. Because you have to
Okay.
manage it. You have to manage it. You don't have a choice.
Yeah, no, absolutely. To tell you what, at this point, let's just pick up there's a really nice, simple question from Alexander in our audience, and he's asked a very simple thing of what is everyone's experience with supplier codes of conduct? So Agnes, I mean, are they effective, or if you've got a crappy supplier who just doesn't care, well, they're going to say, yeah, sure, I'll sign the code of conduct, and they ignore it. So what's your view? Are they really valuable? Are they essential? Yeah.
Yeah, of course they are, because at the end of the day, when it comes to the legal aspect of it, you have already put something in a pen and paper, or put a pen to a paper, as it were, and you've already, most often, you get them to sign on to it. It's another different objective to know if they actually read and understood and are abiding by it. But in the event that your organization is facing a backlash because of some oversight from maybe even your immediate supplier, you can literally use that as a guideline that we stood by these ethics, and this supplier knows that this is what we stand by, and they signed up to it. So you can absolutely kind of dissociate yourself from it, although of course, at first, the media would always, paint what they need to paint. But from a legal perspective, that kind of still protects you,
Yes. Yeah. Okay, that's an interesting thought. And Marcelo, your view as well would be interesting on that. But I mean, I'm just thinking the legal side. The trouble is if a third, fourth tier supplier fails, if it's only the primary supplier that signed your code of conduct, have you really got much legal recourse? And if it's a small supplier and you put them out of business, well,
Yeah,
achieve much. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that supplier codes of conduct are bad, but actually, are they really that effective? I think it's a great question from Alexander here.
yeah, that's an excellent point. I believe that for the legal side, yes, you can be protected, but the legal problem, in my opinion, is the least you need to concern about. The problem of your image and the problem of decreasing in sales is much worse than your legal problem. I remember again saying about the Carrefour topic. They had a image reputation. It was 3 years ago, and they still didn't recover. People still talk about that case 3 years after that.
Wow. Yeah.
And their sales level never returned to the previous one. So yeah, you can be protected from the legal side, signing contracts and have that documented with your suppliers. But in my opinion, it's the least you need to concern about.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, we almost could have a separate episode purely on supplier codes of conduct, but we better move on to our second discussion point, our second main point on the agenda, which is mitigation and management. So this is all around due diligence, monitoring, and contingency planning. And I suppose, as the news item shows, kind of monitoring and due diligence can be really challenging. So I guess, in your experience, Pam, what works well? I mean, I know you talk about being on the ground, but kind of if you've got hundreds of suppliers, can your own organization seriously kind of have the resources to be monitoring and auditing constantly versus having to trust external, respected audit companies?
So that's a very good question. With hundreds of suppliers, it is pretty difficult. But we do have tools that can help us in this current era. We do the Zoom call like this right here. You could do a tour of the facility. I mean, it's kind of staged, so who knows what you're going to find. But I do think you have to have that presence, and even the nth tier suppliers need to know who they're building the products for. I mean, if they have more of an allegiance to the brand that they're actually supporting, that can help with the culture. You almost have to find the suppliers that have the right values, that understand what their motivation is, whether you're a big part of their business or a tiny crumb. But, I think QBRs, meetings with the leadership, you have to judge where the risks are, right? You can't have a presence everywhere, but
Yeah.
I think you have to do the best you can to choose your risks.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. No, thank you. Agnes, what are your thoughts on how you can monitor and manage and do due diligence on a multi-tier supply chain with hundreds of suppliers?
Absolutely. Like Pam rightly said, you just have to weigh your risk. So for me, I think personally, it has to be a prioritization approach, right? So you're looking at your supply chain again, and you're looking at who are my critical suppliers. I'm not saying you're going to discount them, but you're looking at those ones that are quote unquote high risk, maybe based on the kind of products they are bringing, or even their geographical location, like Nigeria, for instance. It's, we have a couple of countries that are high risk, when it comes to, worker welfare and, those critical things. So you look at where your suppliers are coming from, for instance, based on geographical location, or maybe even the items the third party or the end parties, providing for you. And then, of course, there are technologies to help us, but there is nothing as good as go see. And
Yes. Yeah.
I believe a couple of companies do go to do what they call the tests, equipment tests. Maybe a manufacturing firm is making something for you. You want to just go and do the first assessment. So if you could do that just to ascertain the quality of materials you're getting or the equipment you're going to procure, why don't you still also, invest the same effort in knowing where your bottom line, goods and or items are coming from, just to protect yourself from the backlash of an oversight or a blind spot, as it were, right? And like I said, you can't just tick all the box, like we all agreed to. Code of conduct, having your primary supplier sign up to your code of conduct is not enough. So you don't want it to come across as though it's just a punitive document, or you're just there to, fault them. It has to be also a collaborative approach. So let them see you as partners. So by that way, you do engagement, with your primary suppliers now, and you try to understand their own culture and see how you can also imbibe your company's culture, organizational culture to them, and have them translate it to the end supplier, basically.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Marcelo. So I guess Agnes is saying a little bit, sort of, almost trying to balance priorities, and recognizing it might be very difficult to visit every single supplier. I mean, but I guess as you said, things can just come out of anywhere. What's your thoughts on how best to kind of do this due diligence and monitoring and so on?
Yes, exactly. As Pat said in the beginning, you can delegate the activities, but not the responsibility. So you need to make sure that your value chain, your supply chain is working very well. I would say that the first thing you should do to mitigate that is to make a clear risk identification and assessment. You need to do a successful due diligence throughout the process to understand your potential risk. That's the first thing you need to do. The second one, you should keep ongoing monitoring and regular updates. And because it's important that all the second, third, fourth suppliers, it's important that they can be visited anytime, anywhere, and we are going to check all the conditions that they are working. And the third point that I would say, you need to build flexible contingency plan, because things shit's gonna happen, and you need to be ready when that happens in order to save your company. And I would say the last point, you should build also build a strong data and analytics using the new technologies such as blockchain, and AI to help you to identify previously what's going to be the problem in your supply chain.
Okay, no, thank you. Lots of interesting points there. And that sort of leads nicely to our sort of third point, which is you talk about the importance of contingency planning and then having sort of data management and so on. So how, I guess our third point is how automation enhances your visibility and control over nth party supplier network. So Pam, turning to you first. I mean, can you share any methods or solutions which gives you that visibility right down the supply chain? And sort of picking up on your point about, Zoom and things like that. I mean, is anyone using, because I know that there's been great examples where you can literally got kind of, in a way, it's like a camera on a robot, which can just roam around, and that's the sort of thing where you can really say, I don't have to do an inspection and give you warning. I'm just literally going to turn on this camera and I'm going to walk around the factory, and I can see what I see. And I don't know if I haven't read about that coming in yet, but I don't know if those sort of things are starting to happen.
Well, one thing that Marcelo mentioned reminded me of how important the due diligence is in the very beginning, because that's when you actually have the best focus. The ongoing monitoring is a little bit different than the initial assessment. And the mention of that GSAT tool, I just remember in the ISO days, we would do very, very serious audits of our suppliers, even back then, with every aspect, the quality, the finances, the location, any of that, labor issues, stuff like that. So I think that's the time to focus. And then you can set up, the measurements and the data to monitor that location, that supplier, and apply, different levels of monitoring depending on what type of supplier it is and how much risk. You could also decide to actually own that operation or have a stronger partnership. If something is very critical and it's farther removed from your own business, I mean, you could make that decision that it's so important to the business, that technology or that process or whatever it is, that you take further steps to strengthen that relationship specifically. But, I have actually implemented things like a P44, Project 44. I'm not necessarily advertising for anyone, but I think that real-time visibility tracking of materials in transport is really important. I think using transportation management systems, I had never done that in the past. I've implemented one of those lately. That's very, very important. So you can actually have more visibility and insight to what's going on in your supply chain. And with the different tools that people have these days, like Tableau and what have you, Power BI, to build major dashboards with the data, or you could use Resolink, you can use supply risk solutions to monitor the different activities in various regions. The problem is that people have to look at the data. I've seen some of the implementations of things like Resolink where there's a dashboard, a monitor in the procurement area with all kinds of news, like, so that's doing nothing really. And if you have a dashboard that is too flexible and needs to be kind of tuned to whoever is looking at it for whatever their purpose is, in my opinion, the good old fashioned monthly on-time delivery metrics is far superior. You don't need all that. What was it for the week? What was it for the day? You need some regular monitoring of key metrics for all the suppliers. And that's, as Marcelo said, that's very easy to put together. So combining some of these tracking systems and monitoring properly and combined with visits and QBRs, I think you can put together a really good set of automation and kind of manual processes that do the trick.
Yeah. Okay. Great, Pam. I mean, so many interesting points there. I think particularly one of your earlier points was a good one about, and it picks up on what Marcelo was saying about this contingency planning, really understanding where your risks are, and and not just kind of saying, well, our network is as it is, our supplier, network. Actually, if there's some really critical ones far back down the supply chain, yeah, maybe you should own them. Maybe you should have a good sort of partnership and real control of them. So it's a really interesting point, that one. Agnes, what are your thoughts on automation enhancing visibility and control, or indeed anything else you want to pick up? There's stacks of questions pouring down as well from our audience. Thank you for all those. I'm sorry we can't pick them all up, but over to you,
absolutely, absolutely. The technology driven world today has made things a little more easier. But the only thing I think, without beflogging this, the only thing I'll add is these technologies, they do not work themselves. So like Pam said, you see a dashboard, in a procurement department and has all the metrics is what is it do you want to measure? Right. So it comes from the identification. What metrics do I need to measure that will give me visibility or an understanding of my end supplier risk, right? So it could be either the financial instability, whether what region are they right now, what's happening there, or even regulatory compliance, or even as much as the performance again, like Pam said, performance tracking comes in there. So what is the trend? How has this contractor performed in this aspect, in this aspect, in this aspect? So when you have those data already feeded into the, Internet of Things or the AI system, it makes it easy for you to have those predictive analysis, and you're looking at the metrics and you're saying, we're having this consistency about this, risk showing up for this particular end supplier or whatever. So do we have to look further into this? That's when you now decide maybe we should do a go see, or do we do like a video, something. So, but you really need to know what is it you want to measure to be able to optimize and, maximize the use of the data analytics tools that we have. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. And Marcelo, sort of just thinking, with this, we've talked a little bit about some of the legal side of things, supplier codes of contract, what suppliers codes of conduct, the kind of terms, conditions in your supplier contracts and so on. But ultimately, how can you enforce getting detail about your third, fourth, fifth tier suppliers? How do you, have you got any thoughts on that one, or indeed again of the other things we've been discussing?
Oh, yeah, I believe that technology is the only way to go through that challenge, right? So, talking about that, I believe that the good point to start is you're on a platform, a procurement platform, in order to manage your suppliers. I use it a lot. I implemented in aviation and implemented retail as well. The SAP Ariba, which seems to me a really good platform. But it's not enough to have the platform. You don't have the links to the providers, and of course you don't have a process to treat all the deviations. You have the process. And the second technology device, that process that we are using a lot, it's helping us a lot in order to understand what's happening in our supply chain, the blockchain. Because in the blockchain, you have a transparent record of every transaction like that. It ensures us that you can trace all the process back to the origin. So when you have that, and your supplier know that you can track the process to the beginning of the problem, they are going to much more aware and alert about having any kind of problem. And I would say that a third thing that we're using a lot in order to do that is RFID, which we can call it the IoT, Internet of the Things. RFID, it's getting cheaper and cheaper, the technology, and it's getting very useful in order to have the trace of your products in your supply chain.
Yeah. Okay. No, those are good reminders of some of the technologies out there. So just briefly, we're almost at the end of time. I mean, Pam, sort of going around to you. I mean, again, you've certainly worked quite a lot in the medical supply chains, and you'd think those are ones where RFID and blockchain are really sort of more applicable because they tend to be higher value products. Authenticity of the product is absolutely essential, and so on. And have you seen much use of blockchain and RFID? Really becoming widespread there? No. Okay.
Not blockchain. We actually investigated that maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Maybe it just was not mature enough. But part of the problem implementing some of those solutions is that the team needs to really be knowledgeable enough to implement it in a way that it actually works. It sounds very good, but I've seen pretty poor implementations of RFID that actually caused a lot more work and did not provide much value. For example, in a facility, people actually had to put the RFID tags on the products because they're not put on by the manufacturers, and then they have to like re-receive the product into another system. It just, sometimes the folks doing it have a little bit less maturity in how to actually do it the best way. And the company's happy to sell it to you, of course. Um,
Yes.
and actually that kind of leads me to another part of this problem is having
Mm.
enough talent with enough experience to actually understand where the risks could be. With a lot of the, post-COVID especially, fewer people travel around. They think they can kind of see things through the Zoom call or,
Mm.
not necessarily visiting the plant floor to understand how the
Mm.
products are made. It's not rocket science to get some good experience doing these things, but I think people are less apt to be doing that in that hands-on fashion where maybe the three of us here on the panel learned the hard way, over the
Mm.
over the
Mm.
years, understanding the details. It's the details, the devil's in the details. That's all
Yeah.
and you have to make smart decisions and have some experience understanding what you're looking at. It's not just a checklist,
Yeah.
your
No,
exception message.
Yeah, no, and Agnes, I mean, I guess you're talking about that as well. But I mean, I guess the difficult thing, and I think Marcelo was touching on that, is that when you start with a supplier, you do your due diligence, you do all your visits, etc., and it is having the time and the resources to sort of keep that level of diligence going. Have you got any thoughts on how do you justify getting enough resources to visit and inspect frequently?
So I think it's when you've imbibed that due diligence into your culture, because due diligence, it's not a tick the box activity. So in your business plan, you've already made it such that this is how we operate. So it forms an integral part of your organizational culture and your organizational objectives. So if you need to make budgetary, provisions for it at the beginning of a financial year, you need to do that, because at the end of the day, the impact or the effect of not doing the due diligence at the beginning would come back to haunt you. And maybe that budget you're trying to save, you might even risk more or spend more at the end, maybe in some litigation or some, reputational management. So basically, I think it just starts with what your organization wants to do, right? And I think where I'm just going to come from is also when I say culture, maybe from when you start off as a small, medium enterprises, most often when people start up a business, it's small scale. They can still go around, or they might even have, first view of their immediate suppliers. And then the growth comes, they become global because they've not imbibed that culture from beginning. They've not really put that as part of their business objective and that core value. It's just very easy for them to overlook it, and it falls by the wayside, and nobody actually pays attention to it until there is a risk that, springs up, or there is an exposure. That's when they pay attention to it. So it just goes down again back to the organizational culture and what you want to
Yeah.
do.
That's a great point to sort of to finish with Marcelo on. I'll move on to you finally, because yeah, it's a great reminder that for all the process, legal sides of things, automation or whatever, actually it's culture. It's kind of saying, I've got a feel here. I'm not happy with this. I'm going to really, keep persevering with this supplier to kind of get to the bottom of my suspicion or my concern. Marcelo, what are your thoughts on sort of finally on budgets, on justifying the effort for this and the importance of culture?
Yes, yes. I believe that is a central point, because if you don't value this, if you don't understand that this is a very important thing to do, to manage, to oversee your supply chain, you probably not you are not going to take the action to do that. And as as Pat said, probably you're not going to see the value that it generates. You're going to see the cost of doing due diligence is going to come, the cost of implementing blockchain is going to come. But the benefits, if you don't see the benefits, you're not going to be able to bet on doing those to take that actions in order to 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 blend the process. So Probably is the problem is the more important point here is the future where you understand your responsibility, you understand the risk you worry not to take the action, and of course the risk, the amount of money and the effort you want to put in the process of overseeing the whole process.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Well, it's been a great discussion. We've touched on so many different issues. Thank you for our audience. Absolutely stacks of comments. Eshwar, I must give you a shout out because I know you're a regular on the show and have shared a lot of questions and comments. But this week I'll pick up Alexander because I loved the question about supplier codes of conduct and some of your other inputs as well. So thank you, Alexander. You have got a second mug then. So there you go. You can invite a friend to enjoy a cup of tea with matching Supply Chain Talk mugs. So well done on that. Our next episode is at the same time next week on February the 5th at 4 p.m. UK time, hosted by Anna Maria Belica. And the subject then is going to be mitigating customs compliance risks across your supply chain. So do join us at that one. So thank you again to my three great guests, Pam Wiseman of Supply Chain Advisory Services, Agnes Odimaha of Shell in Lagos, Nigeria, and finally Marcelo Arantes of Grupo Elfa in Sao Paulo. So thank you all three of you for fantastic international perspectives as well. Thank you to our audience and all those comments, and I hope you'll join us next week. So goodbye.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Goodbye,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye-bye.